Well, first I want to mention that about Timor-Leste. In 2002, Timor-Leste, in English as East Timor, became the first new nation of this millennium, transcending centuries of colonization and 24 years of brutal Indonesian military occupation, with military training and hardware supplied by the United States military. The United States also gave the green light to the invasion and provided diplomatic support for the occupation. This small Asia-Pacific democracy is a beautiful tropical island, and it celebrated its 21st birthday on May 20th, held its sixth peaceful national parliamentary election the following day. Charlie Shiner and Jill Sternberg, who are two, as you know, Table Talk members and speakers, worked in solidarity with the Timorese people's struggle in the 1990s and lived in Timor-Leste for 15 years from 2001, while the nation was creating its institutions. Charlie continues to work for the Timorese organization Lau Hamatuk. Best translation, I guess, is walking together. And he will share some experiences and observations, as well as what the Timorese people have learned and what we can learn from their journey out of war and oppression. And if you don't know him, Charlie is a long-time Westchester Peace and Justice activist and co-chaired Westpac from 1975 to 1996. Beginning in 1991, he was the national coordinator of the East Timor Action Network, ETAN-US, and the UN representative of the International Federation for East Timor, IFET, where he coordinated 220 international activists who went to Timor-Leste to observe the 1999 referendum that was for independence. Charlie and Jill moved to Timor-Leste in 2001 while the country was under transitional UN administration and lived there until 2016. He continues to visit regularly and work as a researcher with the Timor-Leste Institute for Development Monitoring and Analysis, also known as Lau Hamatek, Walking Together. And it's a Timorese NGO which monitors and advocates for sustainable and equitable policy. Independent, post-conflict petroleum export-dependent nation whose people have already suffered tremendously from two big power conflicts that they had no stake in. Charlie has also authored academic papers in the last few years for Australian, Timorese, and Mexican journals. Charlie will share with us some experiences and observations, as well as what Timorese people have learned and what we can learn from their journey out of war and oppression, as I said. The development of Timor-Leste continues among many challenges as we hear about Timor-Leste at 21. Charlie, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ellie. I'm going to try to share my screen because I want to show some.
Oh, hold on, Charlie. Let me give you.
Yeah, it's not enabled yet.
Yeah, I'll give it to you. 1 second. Okay, should have it.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Is that working? Can you see that?
Yeah, we can see
good.
it.
Okay, great. Let me just get that control thing where I can access it. Okay, yeah, I'm used to giving. Sorry, it's getting ahead of me because it's not where I want it to be. Let's see if we go back here. Yeah. Sorry for the lack of organized start. I'm used to giving talks with lots of graphs and charts to people who already know a fair amount about Timor-Leste, usually the people who are there. And so it's been a little hard for me to try to figure out how to make this interesting for people who are not so focused on the country and maybe don't know much about it. But I'll try, and I'm going to mostly show you pictures, and then we can have more discussion later. As Ellie mentioned, Jill and I moved there in 2001. We moved there 2 weeks before 9/11. It was a good time to leave New York, I think. And people say, "Oh, you're so dedicated, you're so committed to go live in the far away and so forth." We don't see it that way at all. We see it as a great privilege, both because it's a beautiful country and has wonderful people, but also because, like all of you, when I was in high school, I was learning about Marbury versus Madison and the Federalist Papers and things like that, as the United States was creating its democracy. And so we got to watch close up as Timor-Leste was creating its democracy. And it was a real privilege, and it's not one that many people have. So let me start with a map, so you can see where Timor-Leste is. It's between Indonesia and Australia, about as far from here as you can get. And these are some of the key points. This is a slide I took from another presentation, so it's not totally relevant, but basically, as Ellie said, Timor-Leste restored its independence 21 years ago, last Saturday. And it had been ruled by Portugal for 500 years, and then by Japan briefly during World War II, and then by Indonesia from 1975 until 1999. And all of those occupations, particularly the Indonesian one, took a tremendous toll on the people of Timor-Leste. Between a quarter and a third of the people in Timor-Leste died as a result of the 24 years of Indonesian occupation. That, of course, ended 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, and the majority of people in Timor-Leste today were not even born at the time of the Indonesian occupation. It's a very young country. They had a post-war baby boom like many other countries do, and so they had a lot of people born afterwards. They were fortunate or unfortunate, depending on your point of view, to have some undersea oil and gas reserves, and that's given them a little bit of money to get the country started and to finance creating the government systems, building all the government buildings, building an electricity system, an education system, things like that, that the Indonesians had destroyed when they left. But that oil money is running out, and so it's the future is a little bit uncertain. Let me give you the history very quickly. I don't want to bore you with lots of detail, but basically people have been in Timor-Leste for 5,000 years or more. And there are some places you can go where you can see rock paintings that were done more than 1,000 years ago. Portugal came shortly after Magellan was killed in that part of the world, when they were traveling around the world and dominating because of their superior navigation technology. And they brought Catholicism. Timor-Leste is now 97% Catholic, but they did very little to develop the country in terms of economic development, education, putting Timorese people in positions of responsibility. Portuguese, all over the world, they were terrible at that as colonizers go. In 1941, well, actually in the end of 1940, Australia stationed troops in Timor-Leste because they didn't want to fight Japan in Australia. Timor-Leste at that time was a Portuguese colony, and Portugal was neutral in World War II. So there was no reason for Japan to go there. There were no resources that Japan was interested in, except that there were Australian troops there. And so the two countries brought their conflict to Timor-Leste, a conflict that the Timorese people had nothing to do with, and even their government had nothing to do with. And it resulted in about 50,000 Timorese people dying. The Australians left fairly soon afterwards, but the brutality of the war continued. After World War II, Portugal, unlike a lot of the other European colonizers, reasserted its control. And so they reestablished their colony. Portugal at that time was a military dictatorship under Salazar. I put in yellow on this slide the oil-related developments, just to indicate that oil has been a factor in Timor-Leste for a long time. In 1974, the Portuguese military, mostly because they were tired of fighting colonial wars in Africa, in Angola, Mozambique, Cabo Verde, places like that. They began a process. Well, the military overthrew the dictatorship in Portugal, and then, unlike most of those situations, turned the process over to a democratic elected government within a year. And that democratic government in Lisbon began decolonizing all of their colonies around the world, including Timor-Leste. So the people of Timor-Leste organized their own movements for liberation. They were slower than some of the other colonies in terms of defending their freedom, but they declared independence on November 28th, 1975, and Indonesia invaded 2 weeks later. If we think in the context of what was happening in the world at that time, right, this is 6 months after the US lost the war in Vietnam. And the domino theory and the idea that the Cold War, that the Soviets were going to conquer the world, was still very dominant in US policy. And so the US supported Indonesia. Indonesia had been, since 1965, there was a military takeover of the Indonesian government. It was a right-wing dictatorship, loyal to the United States under Suharto. And the US, basically, President Ford and Secretary of State Kissinger visited Indonesia the day before Indonesia invaded Timor-Leste on 7 December. And they said, it's okay, we don't object. Do it quickly and don't use our equipment. Indonesia did not follow either of those instructions. They tried to do it quickly, but the Timorese fought back very hard, and the war went on for 24 years. And they used US equipment, everything from machine guns to helicopter gunships, to all kinds of things. And the US trained Indonesian soldiers and voted to support Indonesia in UN fora and things like that. So for a long time, Indonesia was slaughtering people in Timor-Leste with tacit and active support from our own government. The Cold War ended in the 90s, in the early 90s, or late 80s, I guess. Some of us in the US and around the world saw an opportunity to bring the Timor-Leste issue more to the front and to maybe get the US to stop supporting Indonesia's occupation. Timor-Leste basically got no attention in the United States. Between 1975 and a massacre in 1991, where a few US journalists were there, including Amy Goodman, who many of you know. It was never covered in any of the US mainstream media. No television, not even PBS, ever mentioned it in their newscasts for that 16-year period, in which time more than 100,000 Timorese were killed. But with the end of the Cold War and with the growing pressure on Indonesia to democratize, and with Suharto being forced to resign in 1998 by his own people, in 1999, the new president of Indonesia agreed that the Timorese should be able to vote on whether they wanted to be part of Indonesia or not. He thought that they would vote to be part of Indonesia, but in practice, when the referendum happened, and we were there for that referendum, there were about 1,500 people murdered by Indonesian soldiers and militias who were working for them in the run-up to the referendum. They were trying to terrorize people from voting for independence, but they didn't succeed. And about 80% of the people voted for independence. And so there were 2.5 years of transitional rule under the United Nations. And then on the 20th of May, 2002, what the Timorese say, they restored their independence. Because they had been independent for 2 weeks in 1975. Like the US, we celebrate the 4th of July as Independence Day, even though it was 7 years later that we actually were an independent country. It's the Declaration that makes the independence. So on the 20th of May, 2002, Timor-Leste became a parliamentary democracy. Pretty much the only one in the region where it actually functions as a democracy. And they've had many peaceful elections since then, the most recent one being 2 days ago. And many changes of government. You won't, where the power the parties that were in power got voted out and another party came in. One thing I noticed in the election this week is that within 12 hours of when the results were announced, the two major parties that were in the current government that lost the election acknowledged their loss and welcomed the new leadership. It's a little different than the US. You know, they haven't been a democracy as long as we have, but they seem to know how to do it better. Just some basic numbers about the people. There's very high rates of poverty. Most people are farmers, and it's mostly subsistence farming, which means they grow things to feed themselves, not to sell, to feed their families, and a little bit of barter. They have very high levels of malnutrition, partly because of lack of food, partly because of poor sanitation, which means you're drinking polluted water, which means you have diarrhea, which means you don't retain the nutrients that you eat, even if you eat healthy food, right? So this is not so much a problem that we're familiar with, but it's a problem there. And a result of that is high levels of child mortality. I mentioned the World War II and 1975. In both of those cases, tens of thousands of Timorese people died for conflicts they had nothing to do with. And as we saw in the G7 meeting in Hiroshima a few days ago, and the AUKUS US, UK, Australia treaty that was signed last year, 2 years ago, there's a movement now to create another geopolitical conflict between the US and China, and the South Pacific, Southeast Asia is caught in the middle of it. And I think for those of us in the US, we have an obligation to not allow our governments to make people there suffer once again for something that really has nothing to do with them. The Indonesian occupation, there were many massacres. This picture and the memorial there was a demonstration in front of the Indonesian embassy 10 years after the referendum, so in 2009, about one of the people that committed crimes against humanity that the Indonesian government was sheltering. I'm not going to go into detail on the justice issue, except to say that there's been no significant accountability. There's been a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's been some process for low-level perpetrators, Timorese perpetrators, to get reintegrated into their communities. But the higher-level people and the Indonesian officials and government, and this was an act of government. It wasn't just a few Indonesian individuals committing those crimes. It was a state. They have not been held accountable, and as time goes on, that gets less and less likely. If people want to talk about this more when we get to discussion, I can do that. This is a demonstration that was on that issue, which in Tetum it says, "No justice, no peace," which reminded me of some demonstrations that have happened in New York, that were happening in New York around that time. This is the city of Dili, looking from across the harbor at sunset. You can see it's a port. Dili is the capital of Timor-Leste. It has about 200,000 people. The whole country has about 1.3 million people. And this is what Dili looks like. This is the US Embassy in Dili. They somehow got a prime seaside land for their embassy, even though they would have had an embassy anywhere. They didn't need to get that land. That land could be used for a hotel or a resort or something. But what you can see also in this picture is that Dili is sandwiched between the mountains and the sea. It's a fairly small flat area. It's actually a river delta. And what that means is it's very vulnerable to rising sea levels because it's very flat and there's nowhere to move to because there's mountains you can see in the background. So that's the US Embassy compound where all the green is in the front there. This is one of many demonstrations that Timorese people have had at the US Embassy, or year one. This one was a few years ago. Because Timorese people fought very hard for their independence and their freedom, they empathize with other people who are in similar kinds of struggles. And so this demonstration was about Guantanamo, but there were many others. I'm not going to show you pictures of demonstrations against the U.S. war in Iraq and also to support the people of Palestine and particularly to support the people of West Papua, which is a nearby country that's still being occupied by Indonesia, and Indonesia is still killing people there. I'm not going to talk about that now, but it might be a good subject for another Doris program at some point. The sea in Timor-Leste is spectacular. It's got great potential for ecotourism, and its coral reefs are probably going to last longer than most of the reefs in the world because it's surrounded by very deep water. So the water temperature is not changing as rapidly as it is in a lot of other places. I mean, in the Caribbean, a lot of the reefs are already dead. And in Australia, they're dying, and in other parts of Southeast Asia. But Timor-Leste, it'll be fortunate, though the world will be less fortunate to have probably some of the last coral reefs in the world. People have festivals and parties and events all the time. The picture behind me, which is not the same place as the slide I'm showing, the picture behind me is something that we just came across. We were driving around, going to the beach in a remote part of the country, and there were all these women dressed in traditional costumes having a parade. The one on the slide that you're looking at now is a coffee festival there. And you can see that, the women are prominent, and there are a lot of young people. The men are mostly in the background. That's unfortunately not true in the political system, but it is true in a lot of areas. This is a valley in central Timor-Leste called Saloy Crag. And the guy who's standing in the front is somebody I worked with for about 10 years, and he's now doing a PhD in Australia in agriculture because he wants to help Timor-Leste be better farmers than they are. This valley, it's interesting, this area in 1999 after the referendum, when Indonesia and their militias basically burned down the whole country. Literally, they burned down 3/4 of all the buildings in the country. They just went house to house and threw Molotov cocktails in and burned them down. This village was saved by that because they had a local official who lied to the Indonesian military and said, it's already been burned. You don't have to go there. And so they managed to not experience the worst devastation of 1999. This is another village up in the mountains. That thing in the middle where all the people are and all the tents is the weekly vegetable market. And you can see a few of the buildings all around there. These are the kinds of vegetables that people grow and they sell in the market. Avocados are much better than here. Eggplants, bananas, there's lots of different kinds of bananas, not just the one kind that we can get here. Carrots, oranges, mangoes. You can see those papayas on the left. This is our backyard, the house that we lived in for about 7 years. We had a few mango trees, and our neighbors, the kid is one of our neighbors, used to collect the mangoes, and they would take them to the market and sell them. And we would get to eat the ones that fell in between the times they were collecting them. But it was many more mangoes than we could eat, and so we learned to freeze them and eat them off season. But mangoes that you get here that have been shipped thousands of miles are not the same thing. This is also near where we lived. It's a fishing beach, cohabited by goats. Those are the kind of boats that people use for fishing, and almost all the fishing is near shore from small boats like these. This is the beach that we could walk to from the back of our house, where we walked many, many times. This is one of Timor-Leste's elections. You can see there's transparency. This is actually after the election when they're sorting the ballots prior to counting them. And they hold up the ballots, they hold up each ballot and say who it's voted for, and then everybody can see it. And if somebody wants to raise a question, they can raise a question. It's a low-tech but very transparent voting system, and it's well accepted and embraced by the people. Their turnout in the election a couple of days ago was about 80%, which is like twice as much as people come out for elections in this country, because they fought very hard for their right to vote, and so they value it. This was another demonstration. This is about the maritime boundary with Australia that finally got resolved in 2018. It says, "We love peace and a fairness under the law, under international law for maritime boundary Timor-Leste along the median line." They wanted the boundary to be halfway between Timor-Leste and Australia, which is the normal way in international law that it's settled. I'm not going to take more time to talk about that. This is just some kids in a rural area. There are lots of ways people use to get around the country. This is one way. This is another way. And I think I'll stop there. These three girls are the daughters, actually, of somebody I worked with. They were born like, actually, two of them are her twins, and the other one is her friend. They were born around 2004, maybe. Their father died because he had kidney disease, and there was no provision where he could get dialysis or transplant or anything like that there, because the health system is so weak. Their older sister died because she had an intestinal infection, and the hospital misdiagnosed it. She wasn't eating, she was losing all her energy. And Inez, her mother, who's a good friend of mine, she's college educated. She lives 3 blocks from the National Hospital. She has a good salary. She's probably in the top 10% of people economically. And even so, her daughter died because of totally inadequate healthcare. So Inez now works for Oxfam in Timor-Leste. So I'll stop there, and if anybody has any questions or comments or wants to go into anything in more detail, feel free. Let me just, actually, I won't quite stop there. I'll stop with the slides there, but I just wanted to say, in terms of the US involvement, since all of us here are in the United States, and I guess we're all citizens of the United States, there's 3 factors right now that are relevant. One is the conflict with China that I mentioned. The second is that the US does not have an ambassador in Timor-Leste right now. The ambassador was withdrawn about 6 months ago because he did something that Washington didn't like, and they haven't replaced him. It shows that they basically have no respect for the people of this country on the diplomatic level. But on the economic level, the United States is about to become the largest aid donor to Timor-Leste. I mean, I have lots of questions about how useful international aid is. And this project, which is something called the Millennium Challenge Corporation, it's a 5-year, $460 million program. The organization I work with did a lot of meetings with the US government people while they were designing the program, and they originally wanted to go in and rewrite the legal system and change the law and do all kinds of things that would have been totally counterproductive. And we were able to convince them, we and others, that do no harm should be the main goal of this project. And if you can do something useful in the process, that would be good too. So the project now focuses primarily on water and sanitation, which is a huge need, and it's very important. And hopefully they'll be able to do something that doesn't all collapse as soon as the aid money stops coming in. And a little bit on child nutrition, which is also a pressing need. So it's a chance for the US to do some good in its foreign policy. We don't hear about that very often, but I'm at least guardedly optimistic on that one. So let me stop there, and if anybody has questions or comments or anything, feel free. Julie, if you're talking, I can't hear you. I don't know if you're muted or.
No, I just was wondering if the screen can,
Oh, yeah, I can stop that. Mhm.
there you go. No, I just wondered, Ellie, do you want to field questions? Oh, and Nora has one.
Okay,
And
if people want to raise their virtual hand or their real hand, their questions or comments,
I had a question.
go ahead, Nora.
So I'm wondering how you got involved with Timor-Leste in the first place.
Good question. Relevant to the people of our generation, who is most of the people on this call. My question for my cohorts, the people in my cohort, I was an anti-Vietnam War activist in high school and college, right? And somehow once US soldiers stopped coming home in body bags, everybody in the US forgot about the fact that we were still inflicting our military all over Asia and the Pacific. And so, at that time we had 60,000 troops stationed in Japan. We had 40,000 troops in South Korea. We had 20,000 troops in Indonesia. We had 40,000 troops in the Philippines. And they were all violating the rights of the local people and inflicting hardships, militarizing those countries, supporting dictators to stay in power in those countries. And I got involved in what was at that point called the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific Movement, which started out as the Nuclear Free Pacific Movement. They were trying to ban nuclear testing in the Pacific because the French and the US and Britain had all tested nuclear weapons there. And then it evolved. It was a movement led by Pacific Islanders, and it evolved to supporting also the end of colonization in the Pacific, which has mostly been achieved, but not entirely. There's still Americans, Samoa, and French Polynesia. And then, so I was aware of what was happening in Timor-Leste. I had met people from Timor-Leste who were in exile at some of these conferences of the Nuclear Free and Independent Pacific Movement. And on November 12th, 1991, there was a massacre, a peaceful demonstration in Timor-Leste, in Dili, at a cemetery where Indonesian soldiers gunned down 271 people in cold blood, which was something that had happened many times before. But what was different was that there were some foreign journalists there. Amy Goodman of, at that point, WBAI, this is before he started Democracy Now!, Alan Nairn, who was writing for the New Yorker, a British TV cameraman named Max Stahl, who filmed this massacre. And they were able to get pictures and get the word out pretty quickly to the rest of the world. And so that I and some other people around the US who were aware of Timor-Leste, and there weren't very many people. There were almost no Timorese exiles in the US, and no media attention, as I mentioned. We said, if there's ever going to be a change to the US support for the Suharto regime's occupation of Timor-Leste, this is an opportunity. This tragedy, this massacre, is an opportunity to make people aware of what was going on. And so a month after the massacre, on Human Rights Day, December 10th, 1991, about 30 of us met in front of the Indonesian mission to the UN in Manhattan, and we had a peaceful vigil. And as we were talking there, we said, we shouldn't stop here. We should keep going. And so we started the East Timor Action Network, and it built up to have about 30 chapters all over the United States. It had about 15,000 people on the mailing list at the peak time. And what the hidden agenda that many of us had in ETAN, the leadership of ETAN, was the US is involved in atrocities all over the world. This is one example that's very clear and that most people don't know about. And so we were thinking, if people learn about Timor-Leste, they'll start asking other questions and they'll start learning about other things. And it was pretty successful that way. And I think that's one of the reasons that Noam Chomsky was an early supporter of East Timor and used to talk about it all the time. And he was actually the first person who sent a check to ETAN when we started the East Timor Action Network. I didn't know him at that time, but we sent out a letter to people that we knew were aware of Timor-Leste and said, we want to start this organization. Do you have any ideas, or can you support us? And he'd send a check for $75. So that was ECAN's first donation, other than from the people that were coming to the meetings. So through the 90s, we pressured the US government to try to cut off military aid and to stop training Indonesian soldiers, which they were doing in the US, and then they were doing it in Indonesia. And eventually, when Suharto was pushed out in 98, the US government did not prop him up, which is partly in response to the Solidarity movement, I think. And so then a year later, when Timor-Leste was able to vote for independence, the US initially was not very supportive. Stanley Roth, who was an advisor in the Clinton administration, said, Indonesia matters and East Timor doesn't. The president of Coca-Cola said, think of Indonesia, it's 200 million people in a country where they don't drink alcohol because they're Muslims. Think of that market that we have for our products, right? Indonesia is the fourth largest country in the world. At that time, it was the fifth largest country in the world in population. But when the Soviet Union disintegrated, it became the fourth. It's a huge market. It's a huge source of, at that time, of labor, of minerals, of oil for US companies. And so there was a lot of pressure from they call it the Indonesia lobby, the companies that were making money off Indonesia, not to support Timor-Leste, not because of anything to do with Timor-Leste, but because they didn't want the Indonesian government to be mad at them. But that gradually changed. And by 1999, they had the referendum, and a couple of weeks afterwards, the US was pressured enough, President Clinton, to tell the Indonesians, okay, it's over now, you have to get out. And so there was about a month after the referendum, it became clear that Timor-Leste was going to be independent. Yeah, I mean, why I moved there, why we moved there, partly, as I said at the beginning, it was a great privilege to be part of inventing a new country, but also because at that point, I was pretty committed to support Timorese people, and I knew enough about the world, which they didn't know much about because they've been isolated, focusing on their own struggle, to know that the issues that they'd have to deal with after independence would probably be more challenging and certainly more complicated than the issue of ending a military occupation. And that the US was less relevant at that point. So it seemed like moving there and sort of helping people learn more about the world and influence their own government and the UN and the other international agencies that were there. You know, because of my work in the Solidarity movement, I knew all the Timorese leaders. You know, the current president who was elected last year, José Ramos Horta, is someone who slept on my living room couch when he was in exile, you know. So it's, I have a lot of access, much more access than a lot of Timorese people do. And I want to use that in a way that will support what they need. So that's a long answer to your question. I don't know if I answered it or not.
Well, you answered my question plus, thanks.
Okay, Carol Ann, I see your hand.
You mentioned that there was a lot of poverty there. Do the
Mhm.
people tend to migrate elsewhere for a better life, or they stay there?
Not many people migrate out. In fact, a lot of the people that left during the occupation and during the war came back to Timor-Leste because, I mean, they gave up and struggled and sacrificed so much to have their own country. They want to enjoy it. There is now among the younger generation, there's some, what do they call it? Not transmigration, but people go to work in Australia and in Korea, South Korea. There are government programs in the UK, particularly Northern Ireland. There are people that have gone there on their own, and they work for a few years and they send money back to their families. And most of them have the intention of moving back at some point. Whether that will happen or not, we don't know. But people who go abroad, like get scholarships and go to study in other places. And there've been a fair number of Timorese who've come to the US on scholarships. They almost always go back. I don't know a single example of a Timorese who stayed in the US after coming here for scholarship. There probably are a few in Australia and Portugal that stayed. But, in spite of the poverty, at least nobody's murdering and torturing and raping them and burning their houses down. It's a tremendously better life than it was in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. So people want to enjoy that.
I had one more question.
Oh, and then Michael.
Okay. Education, what is it like for the children there?
It's a big challenge, and it's become a political controversy too, which is part of the problem. During the Indonesian occupation, Indonesia did what the US did in the Philippines in the 1930s. They tried to socialize everybody to be Indonesians. So they sent all Indonesian teachers there. There were basically no Timorese teachers during the Indonesian occupation. No Timorese people who were teachers in schools. And then after the referendum, those Indonesian teachers all left. They all went back to Indonesia. So you're starting with a country that has the physical education system was burned to the ground. The Indonesian military did that after the referendum. And the human part of the education system basically didn't exist because they'd all left. So it took a long time to gradually develop an educational system. Now they have one. The school enrollment is comparable to similar countries. The quality of education is pretty limited. And there are issues about language of instruction, and there are issues about schools that people who have money can go to international schools, and people who have a little less money can go to Catholic schools. So the people that are in the public school system get the poorer education. And even within the public system, there's some schools that are better. They're sort of like charter schools here, but they're government supported elite schools for people that speak Portuguese. Anyway, it's a mess. And it's one of the issues that the NGO I work with has been pressing very hard for, is to give more attention to education. Education gets about 10% of the state budget, which is less than half of what's considered the norm in most countries. So hopefully they'll work more. They've already lost a generation of kids to poor education, and hopefully they won't lose another one. But they need to change what they're doing.
Okay, Michael, and then Cora.
Charlie, thank you for this presentation. I'm wondering about the future of the country, given the fact that they're going to lose a whole bunch of money from the oil revenue that they had, right? So
Yeah.
are you pessimistic about their future?
I'm more pessimistic now than I was a few days ago, because the party that just won the election, is very focused on oil. And they think because they got money from oil in the past, they'll keep getting more money from oil in the future, even though there may not be any more oil that's commercially viable to produce.
Right.
And what happens then is a concept that I've tried a lot to explain to people in Timor-Leste. I don't know if people here know what opportunity cost means. That basically, if you focus on one thing, you're ignoring other things.
Right.
So when they're preoccupied with oil, they don't develop agriculture, they don't develop tourism. I mean, there was a total eclipse of the sun in Timor-Leste a month and a half ago. That's a huge opportunity for tourism if they had done it well.
Right.
But they didn't, and there were actually some groups of international astronomers that had planned to come, amateur astronomers, who canceled, who went other places at the last minute because they couldn't find places to stay. It just wasn't, So the petroleum fund, they have about $18 billion deposited in it, invested in the international stock market, mostly. Some of it's in US government bonds. If the US government defaults in a few days, I don't know what that's going to do to their bonds, but it'll probably have some effect. But they lost $4 billion last year because the stock market went down. Not just the US market, but markets around the world went down. At the moment, they're doing a little better in their investments, but it's totally out of their control and it's totally random. You know, most people in the US who have investments in the market also have other assets, right? Property or whatever. Timor-Leste doesn't really. And so when their government, the current year's budget, about 86% of it is paid for out of the petroleum fund. If they have to cut government spending by 86%, that's going to have a huge impact all across the society. You know, no water, no electricity, no schools, no road maintenance, hardly any police, no, healthcare system. It's all what I guess progressive people in the US would think is good practice. You know, the healthcare system is primarily a public healthcare system. People have to pay very little if they have to pay anything. You know, public education is the primary way of education. Things like electricity and ferries for transport are subsidized so that they're affordable to people. Those subsidies are not going to be able to continue when they run out of money. Last year, the Ministry of Finance finally started talking about this. We've been talking about it. I wrote a paper maybe more than 10 years ago about the petroleum fund is going to run out. But Ministry of Finance talks about a fiscal cliff now. And the World Bank and the IMF use a similar language that, you know, when they can go along for a while and then things are going to crash. And unless they move really rapidly to diversify their economy and to reduce their dependence on imports, right now they import more than 10 times as much as they export in terms of goods. And a lot of it is necessities like food that could be produced locally. If they move in that direction, then when the oil money runs out, it won't have so much of an impact on local people. But if they don't have the imports, and if the local economy right now, the government budget is about equal to the non-oil GDP, so it's almost the whole economy is spending from the petroleum fund. It's going to be a real serious problem when that runs out, and they have less than 10 years to prepare for it. They've already wasted 10 years that they could have been preparing.
It doesn't sound very optimistic.
No, it's not very optimistic.
I'm sorry to hear that.
But I mean, on one hand, it's their own doing, right? It's not the fault of foreign invaders. So, it's up to them to deal with this.
In that respect, they're just like the rest of us, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay, Cora had a question. We have a few more minutes left. Go ahead.
Okay, well, actually, Carol Ann raised education, so that question's pretty much been answered for me. I wanted to ask about what about libraries? What about are they accessible, available, attention, valued? What role does it play in the society? Limited, any?
There's talk about libraries, but there's not really libraries. I mean, in this internet age, people don't use books so much anymore, right? They do have lots of these, you can't see
I
it.
can't see that, right?
They have lots of these mobile
That cell
phones.
phone? Oh, cell phone?
Yeah, and they have one of the highest rates of people using Facebook of any country in the world. And it's good in that it lets people communicate with each other. It's bad in terms of that there's fake news like everywhere. And following the political campaign on Facebook was very depressing because there's all these accusations and charges and false information going out there. Not too different from here. But libraries, and I don't know if this is a Portuguese thing or what, but the idea that books and materials are something that should be made available to people seems to be not part of the culture. Even textbooks in schools, kids don't get textbooks. Teachers keep the textbooks locked in a room, in a closet in the school because they don't want the kids to lose them, right? And so there's been talk about libraries and as donors, there's even oil companies that say they're going to fund libraries. But in terms of it being something, and there are a few unofficial libraries or NGO libraries. I mean, my organization has a library that we let people come and use, but we stopped letting them take the books home because they didn't bring them back. So now they can use them. You know, there's a table, there's a resource room they can work in, but it's not. Unfortunately, it's not a lot of libraries. It's not primarily a reading culture, even though kids now all learn to read in school. But it's, they don't have any books at home. It's not like it's something that they would think to do on their own time.
Is it an oral culture? It's not
Primarily
a
an oral culture, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that you're doing this. The more personally, and I think it applies to our particular group here as well, so the more I learn about other places, the more I learn about my particular, our country and our political. So thank you for spreading the word, and please continue. Thank you. I appreciate this very much, Charlie.
Oh, thank you, Cora. Just one more comment on the oral tradition. The traditional leaders, the elders in the community are mostly men, not all men. They're called Leonine. That's the Teton name for them, which means keeper of the word, right? So that's the way wisdom and history gets passed down, as the old people tell the stories to the younger people.
Thank you.
Okay, if nobody else has, I have a question or two questions, and I know we have limited time. So can you talk about, maybe without getting into the weeds too much, the political parties and also about the relationship with Indonesia today and also with Australia?
Sure, I can try to do each of those in 30 seconds, maybe. Political parties, there are in the elections that they just had, and they have a proportional representation system. Any party that gets more than 4% of the vote is entitled to some seats in parliament. It's not by districts, it's all at large for the national electorate, which creates some problems, but I won't go into that right now. So there are 5 parties that got above the 4% threshold. There were 17 parties on the ballot, but there were 5 parties that got at least 4% of the vote. The largest one is a party called CNRT, National Congress of Timorese Reconstruction, is the acronym in Portuguese. It's a party that was started by Xanana Gusmão, who was the resistance leader, the leader of the military resistance during the last, in the 80s and 90s, and then he was imprisoned in Indonesia for a number of years. And he came back, and he started this political party in 2007. He was president, but he realized that prime minister had more power, so he wanted to become prime minister, so he needed a political party to do that. So that's the party that got the most votes. They got 31 seats out of 65 seats in parliament. So they don't quite have a majority, but they have a large part. The second most voted party was Fredlin, which is an acronym for the Timorese Independence Liberation Front, basically. That was the historical independence party going back to the 1970s. And they got 19 seats in parliament. And then there are 3 smaller parties. One is called the Democratic Party, although it has nothing to do with the Democratic Party in the US. That was formed by student activists during the resistance to Indonesia. And then there's another party called People's Liberation Party, Partido Liberação Popular, which was again started by a former president who wanted to be prime minister, in that case, Tara Matanruak, who is the current prime minister, although he won't be after the new government is formed. And then the other party that got seats is called Kunto, which was started by a martial arts group. Martial arts groups are a problem. It's sort of what we call gangs in the US, although they don't use guns, so they're not quite as deadly as gangs are in the US. But young people, when they don't have jobs and don't have much to do and don't get motivated by the education system, find things to do. They organize themselves, they have turf wars and whatever. So Kunto is based in a martial arts group, and they have a few seats. So the coalition is probably going to be CNRT and the Democratic Party. Those 2 will be the majority, and the other 3 parties will be in opposition. which is sort of a reversal of what the current government situation is. Relations with Indonesia. Timor-Leste has a land border with Indonesia. Indonesia has 200 times as many people as Timor-Leste. Indonesia has shown historically that they have no hesitation in slaughtering Timorese people by tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. And the international community has shown that they will not protect Timor-Leste from Indonesia slaughtering them. So they have the political leadership anyway feels they have no choice but to make nice with Indonesia, which partly has to do with close to $200 million a year worth of goods that are imported from Indonesia into Timor-Leste. So Indonesia is making lots of money off independent Timor-Leste, much more than they made when they were occupying it. And also they politically will not say anything about West Papua that I mentioned before. They will not question human rights violations in Indonesia, which are an increasing problem. And they're looking for Indonesia to help them join ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which Timor-Leste has chosen to identify itself as a Southeast Asian country. It's sort of halfway between Southeast Asia and the Pacific. It could have chosen to be a Pacific island country, but it would rather be like Singapore than like Fiji. I mean, that's sort of what, those are the two countries that are about the same size. And so they've identified with Southeast Asia, and they have good political relations with Indonesia, and they're hoping that Indonesia will help them get into ASEAN. With Australia, it's more challenging. They don't have a land border with Australia, but it's only about 400 miles across the sea. And there's undersea oil deposits between the two countries, or there were. Now they're mostly exhausted. And Australia took advantage of the Indonesian occupation to extract that oil and to start developing that oil for the benefit of Australian and American companies. ConocoPhillips, at that time, Phillips Petroleum, has made a lot of money off Timor-Leste's oil. Australia refused for many years to settle a boundary between the two countries, but they finally were pressured to do that. And in the first ever in world history, UN conciliation process for settling a maritime boundary. The laws had been passed a while ago, but the process had never been used. Led to a maritime boundary treaty that was signed in 2018 between Timor-Leste and Australia. So that was sort of the main irritant between the two countries. And that's now sort of aside, but there's still Australian oil companies that are doing things that Timorese people don't like. And so there's still some conflicts there. Just a little story on Independence Day on Saturday. Every year that the Timorese government awards medals to people that they feel support, help them, internationals and Timorese people. I got one some time ago. And one of the people that got a medal this year was an Australian lawyer named Bernard Collaery, who was a lawyer in the Australian intelligence agencies. There's a system where people who work in these agencies can consult legal support in confidence, and I forget what it's called exactly, but anyway, Collaery was working for that legal process, and there was an intelligence agent, an Australian agent, who is still anonymous. He's called Witness K, but I don't know his real name, who went to Collaery in 2013 and said, I'm aware I was part of an operation where the Australian government pretended to be a construction company, but actually planted microphones in Timor-Leste government offices and used those to eavesdrop on Timorese meetings preparing for the maritime boundary negotiations. And I think that was wrong, and I want to do something about it. And so Collaery represented him, and the information eventually got brought to the public, and Collaery was prosecuted. The Witness K was prosecuted too, but Collaery was prosecuted, his law license was lifted, his passport was lifted, and finally, last year, Australia elected a new government, and they stopped the legal process against him and gave him back his passport. So his trip to Timor-Leste this week to get the award was his first time he's been allowed to leave Australia in about 5 years. So he's considered a hero in Timor-Leste, but he's not considered a hero in Australia, except by some people.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for this presentation.
Yeah, I'm sorry it
And-
wasn't more organized, but I hope it was interesting.
Pretty good,
It
Charlie.
was very interesting. And you suggested perhaps West Papua.
Yeah, there's a West Papuan activist who lives in New Haven, in Hamden, actually near New Haven, who I'm going to see in a couple of weeks, and I can ask him if folks would be interested in learning about his country, if he'd be interested to come or to talk.
Good.
Thank you, Charlie.
Cool.
This
And
is,
and don't forget next week, Sheila Collins on full employment and possible legislation. Push for
Or-
that.
Chuck Bell.
Or Chuck Bell, right, but more likely Chuck. So
Thanks.
thank you again, Charlie.
Thank you
You're
so
welcome.
much, Charlie.
As when I
Thank
sign all my
you.
emails, as lutas continuam, which means the struggles plural continue, which is what people say, a luta continua. That's the Portuguese colony struggling for their independence, but there's more than one struggle,
Yeah.
and we all have to be part of them.
And you certainly do very well.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Good night, everybody.
Good
Bye.
night. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.